All right, welcome everybody to the 11 o'clock session of day 2 of Nerd Summit. Next up is Creative Coding with P5.js, a gateway drug for the code phobic, by Chris Amato. All right, take it away.
Thanks so much. Yeah, so I'm Chris Amato, and I'm just going to share my screen so we can see what I see on my screen. And I'm going to keep the presentation in edit mode just because oftentimes I realize that I forgot to say something and I want to, or if somebody makes a suggestion for something, I'd just like to dump it right in and then we can share the presentation after. So that's why that's why it looks like this. So yeah, I'm really excited to share this talk. I should tell you a little bit about myself, just so you know, yeah, just so you have a little bit of background. And so I run a web development shop called Nectar, and I started coding quite a while ago, like 15 years ago in web development. But I always had sort of a side passion for what's called creative coding, or I mean, it's not officially called that, but just like coding in such a way that you get the sort of like kind of instant gratification of seeing pretty things. Back in the day, when I first started learning some of this stuff, it was all done in Flash. If anybody's old enough to remember Flash, Flash is sort of dying or almost dead. But a lot of the stuff that you can do in P5 is sort of analogous to things that we used to do in Flash. So I have background experience in that, but then I kind of like went kind of cold on coding for many years, just as I kind of became more of a manager of Nectar. And then about a year ago, I was like, you know what? I miss coding. I just miss the satisfying feeling of just like making pretty things on the screen, and figured, okay, what tools should I use? So I did some exploration and discovered P5. And I'm going to just share a little bit of resources that I use. And it's literally just in the last year that I just sort of retaken this up really just at a hobby level, and I just find the benefits so fantastic that I really want to just share them and share with you like some of the just adventures in coding that can come. Especially nowadays when everything's so stressful, like I actually find it like incredibly therapeutic to just like sit in front of the monitor and just like start writing code and start making pretty things. So I want to share that with you, and hopefully you can come up with pretty things too. So let's dive in. So I just want to do a quick, we don't have to do anything formal or fancy. I just want to get a quick gauge of, can we do a hand raise of, I guess this is a 3-choice thing. Let's just make it binary so we can use the yes/no function. Let's say, or I guess we could do it in 2 steps. So in terms of coding experience of the folks on the call, can you raise your hand if you have not a stitch of coding experience, meaning like you've literally never written anything in code, not even HTML or anything? Just quick raise of hands. All right, so great. So that brings us to B. Okay, let's do B. How many people have written just some basic HTML, CSS, maybe a little bit of JavaScript? Raise of hands. Okay, so that means everybody here has a fair bit of coding experience. Is that, can we just to make sure that that's true, can everybody raise their hand who has a fair bit of coding experience, just to like rule out the nulls? Oh, raise hand or yes, I guess either one is good. Okay, so there's a few folks that didn't answer, but I'm getting the sense that overall we're at sort of like, it sort of suggests that I can go a little bit faster than just, you know, I've been starting to teach kids and kind of newbie adults. And when you're teaching kids of different ages, there's a very different pace. A lot of times the pace is like, okay, what is a semicolon? So I don't have to do any of that stuff, and we can go a little bit faster, which is great. Obviously, if I'm going too fast on anything, just slow me down. You can always ask me questions later, or you can always interrupt right now. But we'll just take that as it comes. So that kind of answers that question. Okay, a bit about P5. So P5 is a framework. It's like a library that sits on top of JavaScript. Its origins are basically, it's related to processing. The processing library goes quite a few years back. I don't exactly know how old, but this has been around for, since 2001, which is basically a framework that lives on top of Java. P5 was sort of inspired by this as basically to provide folks with a very kind of beginner-friendly environment to do visual programming, with the premise being that visual programming is gives you the satisfaction of getting a result quicker than doing kind of more abstract types of coding. So that's where it comes from. It was built by the same people, or at least some overlap with the people. You can see P5 is right here. And then there's also a Python version of this. If you're a Python person, just so you know, Python is there's kind of like an equivalent library, and a lot of the syntax is almost identical, but it's like using Python instead of JavaScript, or in this case, Java. So that's a little bit of background. Why P5 as opposed to others? There are other libraries out there. Here's just like a quick list. There's a lot of reasons, but these are the big ones. There's a great community. There's a million examples. Learning P5 is basically learning a flavor of JavaScript. And so if you have ambitions to get deeper into coding, there's no escaping JavaScript anymore. It's like basically taken over the world. So it's a good entry point for getting into JavaScript if you want to go in that professionally. There's a free online editor. You can code it anywhere. We're going to be using the free online editor. It's geared toward visual learners, beginner-friendly syntax, but it's actual syntax, JavaScript. So you can actually extend P5 to do whatever you would want to do in JavaScript. You can add in different kinds of libraries. You can write, quote, more native JavaScript at any point, for better or worse, given that JavaScript is such a loosely typed language. It can be, for beginners, it can make it actually more challenging because you're not protected by having to name your variables in very specific ways. But I consider that a benefit. It's not so contained of an environment that you can't extend it. Okay, other things, just sort of, I won't spend a lot of time in this, but the most important things to know are that the reference documentation is fantastic. It's really beautifully spelled out. Every one of the sort of specific library terms are well documented, with usually in almost all cases with examples. So you can always just copy and paste code to just zero in on a particular thing. And there's also a bunch of great examples here on the website, from very basic to very complex. You'll see there's very advanced things here which have quite a bit of code. But I think of that as great. So, okay, so let's look at the editor. In fact, I would love if everybody just opened up their browser. I'm just going to clear this, and just so I have a sense of who is going to try to follow along, can we do a quick yes or raise hand to say, I plan on trying to follow along as we code here. Awesome. Great. It seems like it's at least half. Good, or around half. That's awesome. So yeah, so I'd like everybody to, actually we're not quite there, but we'll get there in a sec. You can do this now, but basically just go over to editor.p5js.org. And just so you can get that started, I'm going to just say a little bit more as you're doing that. While you're doing that, I'll keep talking for a sec. Then I just wanted to mention, if you're not aware, if you've done any exploration to this world of P5, this is the dude. His name is Daniel Schiffman, and he's just like a hero. He's just a beautiful man. I love him. um, he's just got a million videos, not just on P5, but also on processing, also on like all kinds, a whole broader, much broader range of coding. Everything from like machine learning to doing more advanced node type stuff and doing open socket stuff. You can actually like do a lot of fairly tricky stuff using P5. There's some limitations that mean that it probably isn't the ideal platform for doing like sort of real professional level applications. But I would say that it's absolutely fantastic for doing prototyping. In fact, I want to show you just a couple of examples before we get into the code itself, just to give you a sense of like the range of things you can do with P5. And okay, so yeah, here, I'm just going to show you a example here. So like I built a little prototype called Choose a Roosie, which is like a little application that lets you do, help with sort of like decision making. Like if I want to, have a difficult decision to make, I can sort of set the parameters, idea 1, idea 2, and then I can like, weight these things. So this is just like a kind of a fun prototype idea for a piece of software that, you can just do yourself. Like, this isn't, it took a while to code this and to learn how to code it, but that's just like an example of like how P5 can be really nice for just doing like really straight up prototyping. And then that's one thing. The other thing you can do is the thing that I end up doing more of than this kind of prototyping though is just like doing various kinds of like kind of visual algorithms. And we're going to be trying to build one today. But just to give you a little bit of flavor, here's just like a couple of other ones. So here's one that's just kind of like a fun animation where we've got like a bunch of circles flying around and they're all connected with these Bezier curves. Here's one where I'll just show you a couple more. The idea is just that like you get to just play. Like here's one where I'm just making a face and I'm having the face kind of like animate with some random noise to kind of give you like sort of, algorithmically generated faces. And so on. I'll just show you one more. I'm just kind of picking some fun ones from, here's one that I didn't write that's just super fun. It's a snowflake maker where you can, as you're drawing, you can kind of make make patterns. This is one that is straight out of a Daniel Schiffman tutorial. So yeah, just like in terms of like background, that's probably good enough to get going. Before I keep going with the demo, let me ask if anybody has any questions so far, just in like the broad strokes of P5, or just about it as a framework. Okay, let's see. Make sure that, okay, I haven't been looking at the chat. Let me look at the chat here. Somebody said it was just watching as one of his videos. Somebody remembers the Flash days. Cool. Yeah, Daniel Schiffman is just like a total pleasure to watch. He's humorful and just super smart too. Just like you can watch him. Watching him code is really fun because you're sort of seeing him think, and oftentimes he'll like change his mind and like realize, oh, I could do this a different way. I'm going to show you a different way. It's kind of entertaining. Okay, cool. So let's just go for it. So I'd like everybody to just open up the P5 editor and create an account, or I can close this and leave this open. So just would it impress prospective employers? That's a great question. I don't know. I think it depends on what you're applying for. Like if you're applying for like a JavaScript programming position, I would, as an employer at Nectar, I would probably take it with a grain of salt. I would sort of be looking for like more production level experience in terms of I would want to be seeing, okay, it's cool that you do this, but do you also do React? I'd be looking for like that kind of framework JavaScript experience. However, if the job that we're talking about is more of an information architect, product designer, prototype developer, I would actually be very impressed, because that would mean that like the person has the aptitude to do real coding, but not necessarily at like production levels. They're using it as a more advanced tool than just using like a wireframing tool to convey ideas around software. So yeah, so yes and no. Okay, so let's do. I wanted to give you a quick tour of the P5 editor. So I'm just going to assume everybody has registered. You can register either with Google, GitHub, or just create a native account. You can just, sorry, a couple more things. You can also code in Atom, and Atom has a really nice P5 package, which gives you the benefit of autocomplete. So that's a nice thing, and a million other things that are great about Atom. I think there are other editors, professional editors, that support P5, but that's the one I've used. And then, yeah, let's just talk about the editor. And here we go. And then the code that we're going to be trying to work toward today, the sample is here. Just one more thing about, well, I'll show you in the editor. So I'm just going to give you a quick tour of the editor. There's nothing too mysterious here, but there's some nice secrets that you might not, or just nice tips that you might not have been aware of. First thing is, like, there's a few modes. You can go in light mode, dark mode, and high contrast. You can change your font size based on this. I'm actually going to increase it just for visibility during the coding. Yeah, that's a little bit much. Yeah, about there. Cool. That's good to know. You should know that there's a thing here which lets you manage files. This is pretty amazing for a free online editor, that you can actually like create additional JavaScript files. You can actually also upload assets. So like if you're doing a coding sketch that has an image that you want to bake into your code, you can use that. Let's see. So you can also add folders, add files, and so forth. I haven't tested all the limits in terms of like what the file size limit is, or all the file types extensions that might be accepted or not. But just like for the most part, you'd be using this to like either create new JavaScript files, or to create, add assets like images. Let's see. One thing you should know is if you do decide to create another JavaScript file, and that really isn't necessary unless you're doing more involved coding, but I've definitely needed to, like in that prototype that I showed you before with like the circles and stuff, it was absolutely necessary to create quite a few files to organize the code. You have to make sure that when you go in here, actually that's a little bit big. You have to add the file name. So if you ever add a JavaScript file, you would just have to go in here and say, new file.js. That's just important to know. I'm not going to bother with that because we don't need it. You can always hit Control S to save, or actually, now I'm trying to remember whether there's an auto save or not. I know there's an auto refresh. I actually think there is not an auto save. I think you need to hit Control S or go file save. So that's just worth noting. Cool. So that's there. Let's get back to our starter file. A couple other things. You name your file up here. So, my new file. And okay. And then once you have your code, there's two places it can run. It can run here in the preview, or it can run, you can also, there's a bunch of share functions which are really nice. And you just click out here. By default, my sketch has a little bit to it, which I'll explain in a second, but here it is. Now I'm running it as a standalone file, which is nice for presentation. There's another version which is full screen, which gives you the same thing, but it also gives you this so that if you want people to easily access your code, you can do that. That's nice. All right. Okay, cool. I think that's probably enough. Oh, yeah, there's one other thing that is just really handy, which is let's say I just type some code. Here, I'll show you a little bit of code here. You know, about another piece of the editor is that you can do a you can present information in the console. So I'm just going to type in, you know, hello world, and now it's loading hello world. I'll explain why it's loading it so many times in a second, but that's just another really handy thing to know about. If I run it here, you'll notice it only runs once. Cool. So any questions before before we dive in? I feel like there's probably plenty of background on P5. Okay, cool. So so first thing we're going to do is understand what is going on here. Like when you create a new file, you get a couple of things for free. One is this function, two functions. One is called setup and one is called draw. The important thing about this is that setup just runs once. You don't necessarily need it in all cases. You usually at least need to create the canvas. The canvas is basically like the container that all of your code will run. But technically you can run that even in draw, although I don't know if I've ever tried that. Let's just see what happens. Yep, it works. But what happens in draw is this is looping. So this is looping basically at 60 frames per second, meaning 60 times per second this code runs. For the most part, you don't need to regenerate the canvas. In fact, I think it's probably a weird thing to do, so I wouldn't do it. I haven't done it enough to know exactly all the ways that can foul up your code, but it's just generally not a thing that you would want to do. And then again, so within draw, this is really critical if you're doing animations. If you're not doing animations, you may not even need draw. So we'll see that in a second. It's really important to know the difference between these because you can get confused depending on where your code lives. Okay, so let's see. A couple of things. So when you're creating a canvas, that function, so this is a built-in function within P5. And you'll see those built-in functions, those keywords are going to be highlighted in blue in the editor, and I think they'll be highlighted in something special like that in your Atom, if you're using Atom. And obviously that can change depending on your theme, but they'll be highlighted relative to other code. And then the create canvas function takes two parameters, and basically this is the XY position of your canvas, so or the XY dimensions. The first is the width, and the second is the height. And the most important, or one of the most important things to know is that your origin is up here in the upper left. So 0, 0 is up here. So if I make this 800, it's going to count from 0 to 800, and if I make this 800. It's going to go from there to there. Okay. Now, one thing I really like to do is I like to have my canvas take up the whole window. I don't know why I kind of obsess about that a little bit, but if you want to do that, you just go. Sorry. The keyword is window width, and then window height. And that will guarantee that it's always taking up the full screen. You can actually technically use window width for the height, and then that will basically, or let's do it the other way. So window height. So now the window height is this, and it's going to set whatever that value is to the window width. But that's just something you can do. And then the next thing we'll look at is the background, and the background takes a parameter which is the color. And so color in P5, just like just generally in JavaScript, is RGB. You can use other color modes, but let's just stick with RGB for the moment. One thing I really like to do is just use the color picker that Google provides, just when you type in color picker. And you can always just like take these values right here. You can just use this nice little GUI, pick your RGB values, and then pop those in, and that will give me the color that I just chose. So there's 3 parameters, RGB. So if you're not familiar with how that works, is the most that it can be is 255, 0 to 255. And then, so if I want a lot of red, I would just make that, I would max that out. So that's making this more red. Let's make this 0, 0. Now it's all red. If I want to make purple, I would ramp up my blue. So R and blue and red makes purple. So there we go, purple. Now, there's another thing I can do, which isn't going to be as interesting in the background, but the 4th parameter in RGB is the alpha value, meaning how transparent it is. And it's the same thing. It goes from 0 to 255. So if I make this, if I make it 0, now it's basically my background has 100% transparency. If I make it 100, well, I can't really tell the difference because it's now like, I don't think I'm going to be able to tell the difference because it's not in contrast to anything. So that will be more interesting once we do a little bit more. So I'm going to set mine to 0 just to make it black, partly to contrast it with like the surrounding here. And then the other thing I want to do just while we're here is, remember I opened this sketch over in this window. I'm going to refresh that, and there it is. There's my sketch in kind of full screen mode. Okay, so now let's start making some shapes. Let's see, we're gonna make a, let's just start with a rectangle. And for all these basic or primitive shapes, it's often really nice to just have the reference library open. And so you can see some of these here, like, you know, I'm not gonna be able to explain all these by any stretch, but just to give you like a quick example or two, we'll be looking at like ellipse and rectangle now. And for each of these, you'll see that there's different parameters. So in this particular case of the ellipse, you've got basically like, it's really 3 parameters. You can get away with as few as 3 parameters if you want to just assume that the width is the same as the height, which would basically amount to a circle. And then I don't know what this is, so I'm going to skip it. Sorry, I've just never used it, but obviously we can look into that. So let's just try that. So ellipse, the first 2 parameters are the XY position. And again, remember that critical thing is that 0, 0 is up here. So if I set that to 0, 0, and then I set the third and fourth parameters, which is width and height. So I'm going to make a circle that's 100 wide and let's say 200 tall. We'll get a circle that's centered on 0, 0 and is basically cut off by the canvas. If I want it to be more visible, I'm going to push it out. I'll push it out to like say 300, 300. And what that's doing is it's going 300 this way and 300 this way. Cool. And now if I want this to be a circle, I would just, there's 2 ways I can do it. One is I can set it to 100, 100, and that way the width and the height are both the same. Or I can be lazy and just skip the second one and it will assume the 4th parameter. All right, any questions on that? Cool. Now let's give this some texture. Or some, not texture. I don't know how to do texture actually, but let's give it a color. And so the way you do color is it's called fill. It's again, it's like all these colored terms, like ellipse. Fill is another P5 term, and basically the way that works is the same as background. Now we're going to just give that a color. Let's pick a color. I'll just make it kind of greenish. I think that'll be greenish. Make it more green blue. I don't know why, just to play with it. There's green blue. And basically what this does is it makes everything that comes after it in the code green. So cool, it's very basic stuff. Does it draw from the edge of the circle or from the edge? It's from the center. And I don't know if there's a thing in rectangles which is called rect mode, and I don't know if there's an ellipse mode. I'd have to look it up. I'm just going to look it up now. Ellipse mode P5. Oops. Oh, there is. Cool. So ellipse mode is center or corner. By default, it's center, but I can use ellipse mode to make it corner or radius. I have to think about how that works. Using radius. Why? It's not immediately obvious to me how that works. I have to play with it. But basically, let's actually do that, because this is going to show up again. So if I go here, go back to 0, 0, it's using that. But now I'm going to go up here in Canvas. I'm going to set this globally to corner. So now if I comment this out, so quick thing, commenting out is done with // or if you're on a PC, I don't know if it's the same on a Mac, Control/ automatically. Like if I take all this code and I just hit Control/, it'll comment it out. And then if I click that again, it will uncomment it. So if I comment out ellipse mode and I reload it, by the way, reload in the preview is Control Enter. I'm just a shortcut head, so I'll just mention them as I go. You can always just go back here and hit play. Actually, while I'm talking about that, I can mention that command/ thank you on Mac. And then auto refresh would basically say, rather than needing to hit Control Enter, oops, automatically going to refresh. That's really, really cool for basic stuff. If you're getting into more complex stuff, just be careful with it. Like, meaning if you have code that might crash your browser, which is unfortunately rather common in my case, because like a loop goes awry or something like that, you will then not really want auto refresh, because it'll just kind of constantly crash your browser until you've debugged it. So I actually usually keep that off, but if it's basic stuff, there's no reason not to keep it automatically refreshing. Habitually, I'm just hitting Control Enter when I want it rather than using that. Let's see. Cool. So that's good to know. I had never heard about ellipse mode until somebody just asked. And now I'm going to, do I want that? I think I'm going to, yeah, sure, why not? We'll keep it. Okay, but before I go too far with making this dazzling drawing any more dazzling, I'm going to show you a couple things that are really important to understand. One is, let's say I put this code up here in setup. You'll notice that I put the ellipse mode in setup to sort of like instinctively. And the reason is because that's like something that I would probably want to apply globally to my entire sketch rather than have it switching from ellipse mode to not ellipse mode in various different contexts. So that's like a natural thing to put up in setup. But let's think about what happens if I move this code that I created into setup. What happens? So I don't know if you're going to be able to see this over Zoom, but maybe just somebody say whether you can see that or not. You see the green dot for a second flash? Great. Well, why is that happening exactly? That person, Alex. Hi, Alex. How are you? What's happening is this runs once, and then this runs continuously. So the background is just running over and over. Now, one way we could fix that is just to comment out the background. And there it is. But now we have no background, right? So that's not necessarily a big problem. But usually you'll want a background. Unless there's no animation, in which case I would just put the background up here. And then it's no problem. If there's no expectation that if you're just making a pretty thing that doesn't move, then there's just no reason. You don't even need draw, and you can just get rid of it, and then you're happy. But again, in a lot of cases, it's just more fun to make things move. So we'll keep the background. And again, what's happening now when we put it down here is very important to, I mean, it took me a while to really like intuitively get this, but basically what's happening on every frame is we're literally redrawing this ellipse 60 times per second. And when we start to move things, the difference between putting it in setup and putting it in draw is even more dramatic. So what we're going to do now is we're going to introduce a variable. I'm realizing that we're probably not going to get through my whole demo by probably a long shot, given that we're going to, I'm wanting to build up sort of basic concepts, but feel free to like talk to me after if you have questions about the code that's in the presentation, which I'll be sharing, which is here. I just think these concepts are so important if you're new to P5 or new to P5 coding. So the next thing we're going to do is we're going to create a variable. Okay, so variable, there's a number of ways to do it, but just for now we'll say variables. We're going to create it outside of all the functions up here at the top as a global variable, meaning this variable will be accessible from anywhere in the code. And what we're going to do is we're going to create, we're just going to call it X position. Basically, that's going to be where does this, we're going to use this to control like the position of the dot on the screen. And so right here, we can assign an initial value. Let's just call it 100. And then we'll create another variable called Y position. And now what we can do is we can take these variables and instead of just putting these hard-coded values into the X, Y positions of the ellipse, is we're going to put them into, we're going to use these variables. Cool. So now, now when I run the code, which is in my case just I'm hitting Control Enter, it's using those values. Now, if I want to get this thing to move, how would we do that? So what we need to do is we need to increment that value somehow, such that every time this ellipse is drawn, it's taking the dynamic value, it's taking the updated value. So there's a few ways to do that, but the way we'll do now is just we're going to say X position equals whatever its previous value is plus some number. So let's just say +1, and let's rerun our code. Let's see what happens. All of a sudden we're moving. It's that simple. And now, just so you know, there's another way to do that, which is pretty common, which is to just say X position ++. That basically adds 1 to that value. Another way of doing this, if I didn't want it to be +1, is I would say plus equals, say 0.1, and basically that will slow it down. Okay. Now, one thing else I could do is I could say, let's say I wanted that speed to be a variable. So I can go speed equals I'll say 0.5. And now I'm using this, now I'm using that variable to control the speed. So this is like should be pretty intuitive. Let me know if, oh yeah, sorry, good point. The semicolon is, I think we can get away without it. I'm just concerned long-term and for bigger code bases whether it will create problems. I think there are certain syntaxes where the semicolon is, or the lack of semicolon is forgiving, and then there's others where it's not forgiving. I think it's in arrays maybe, or in loops where the semicolon may end up being required. So I just do it habitually. Also, you know, I think in Python it's not a thing, but yeah, it's going to depend on the situation. I would recommend it for the most part. So right now we have our thing going to the right so again, what's happening is on every frame, 60 times per second, this position value is updating. And if we want to see that value in action, we can use the console log. And now when we run the code, you can see that value incrementing by whatever that speed value is. It's basically kind of setting the velocity. If we wanted to get this thing to also move in the Y, update in the Y position, we could do that. You can just do Y position is going to update by the speed. If we wanted to get it to go backwards, we would decrement the value. That's going to take us off the screen pretty quickly, but that's the idea. So you can use, this will reduce the speed, reduce the X position by that amount every frame. Cool. So let's get this down to a little bit slower so we're not losing our thing too quickly. And do a couple more things. So we only have a few more minutes. So God, this went so much faster than I was hoping. This is a lot to cover. I want to, this is another important fundamental, which is, let's say I wanted another ellipse. If I just copy and paste that code, no problem, right? Problem is I can't see the difference, right? Because there's literally two ellipses with the exact same position, updating at the same rate. Well, there's a couple of ways I could differentiate them. One is I could set this guy to a different pace. So I'm going to just set this to, I'll just make this guy like +2 or plus maybe 20. Let's see what happens. So now they're a little bit offset. That would be one way to do that. Another way to do that is I could make this guy bigger. Now they're different. Now, what if I wanted to make them a different color? I could do that. So the way I would do that here is I would actually add another fill statement here and make it a different color. And let's maybe make that transparent so that I can see the other guy that's sneaking behind him. I'll make it, let's say 100 opacity. So there we go. Now, the problem with this is like, this is great, but what if I wanted to make a lot of circles, like not just a couple? We're gonna either, we either need to copy and paste this code a million times, which is kind of like a rough way of doing it, because especially if you want to do like 1,000, right? That's ultimately not practical. And so for this kind of thing, we're going to want to think about creating a loop. And I think we can maybe pull off teaching a loop in the last 4 minutes. Let's see if we can do it. And there's a couple ways of doing loops and thinking about the question of multiple objects. The way I'm going to show you now is like a sort of like a kind of a fairly basic way of doing it. The more advanced way of doing it, which, again, I think if we were doing a more advanced course, I would start there and just sort of show you like what's called like a more object-oriented approach. And again, like the code that I'm going to share is object-oriented, and I won't really have time to explain it, but just so you know that what I'm showing you here is like kind of like a quick way of getting a lot of objects on the screen. Let's just give it a shot. So in general, the way you want to do for a loop is, here's the structure for a loop. You go for, and then there's a number of terms that go into a loop. So I'm going to create a variable. So I'm saying let. I'll just use var. It will work just the same. Usually you use let when you're in a local function. You'll use let, and if you're in a global variable, you'll use var. So anyway, yeah, I could just use let. There's not a huge thing there. And so I'm going to go let. Actually, I think I'm going to do this in setup. It's going to be a little bit too much because to do this in draw, we would need to use an array. So I'm just going to do all this in setup. I'm going to move my background to here. Let's just make sure that my code still runs. It doesn't because there's a bug here. Oh no, that's because of that. I'm just going to get rid of this and then, okay, great. So now what I'm going to do is take this, I'm going to write my for loop up here. And for let I equals 0. And then what you do next is you go, starting at 0, I is going to go up until it hits the number of, say, circles that I want, which is going to be, let's just make it, whatever, 10. And then increment by 1. So I'll just go plus, just the way I showed you before. And then I do a parentheses for that. And then I do curly brace. That's sort of, I didn't really mention that, but every one of these functions is kind of braced by these curly braces. or kind of contained by those curly braces. So I need that curly brace for my for loop. And then instead of just picking these ad hoc numbers, what I'm going to do is I'm going to say, let's just make them all the same color for starters. And then I'm going to say, instead of ellipse at those specific variables, I'm actually going to go so go I. So now what happens is this is going to go from 1 to 10. And so each time I go around this loop, it's going to go up by 1, which means the position of my ellipse is going to go up by 1. And the question is, am I going to see much? Let's just try. Let's just see what we get. You can kind of see it's happening. It's a little bit too tight to see. And I noticed I forgot to answer a question about the border. Basically, yes, there is a border. So I'll just show you that border. I'm going to make the border like white, which should just be like 255. And then I can make the border thicker by going stroke weight. And then make that, say, 3. Now you can see that white border. If we want this to go more dramatically, let's say we multiply these times 10. Now we're getting a nicer spread. So this is like a basic way of getting like a lot of circles on the screen. It's not necessarily the most interesting way in the sense that it's following a very strict mathematical geometry, but it's again, it's a way of like a very straightforward, basic way of getting a lot of things to happen with just a little bit of code. Like it's certainly better if you were trying to do this one by one. There are other ways, as I mentioned, like if we were to create an array, that would give us some more options in terms of like storing variables and then manipulating those variables from the array, and then yet a more advanced way, which I'm happy to sort of walk folks through if they're interested after the call at a separate time, using objects. So yeah, I don't want to push our time limit too much given out of respect for the next talk, but let me just pause there to see if there's any questions that haven't already been asked. I know there was one about, yeah, we covered the stroke question. Why does it lag for a second while moving? So I didn't catch that. Did anybody else catch that? The lag?
I mean, I saw it, but I'm looking at it through the video share, so I don't know if it was just
Oh,
something with the video share.
might have just been the latency. I
Yeah.
don't know. Yep. What are my favorite P5 tuts? What's a tut? Sorry. Tutorials. Yes. My favorite is probably this guy. I mean, this is the one that sort of like inspired me to get back into coding. So this was Daniel Schiffman Maze. This was a beautiful tutorial. I just can't really recommend it enough. It's advanced, but it's just super pleasurable and has given me so many ideas for creative coding and so forth. So anyway, cool. Yeah, no problem. Cool. Anything else before we wrap? Cool. Well, you know where to find me. If anybody has any questions after, feel free to reach out, and don't hesitate to steal my code. Like anything that you see in here is accessible. Like for my Nectar account, you'll be able to see all the code that I've ever written in this P5 editor and just have at it, fork it, do whatever you need. All right. Take care. Thanks again. Bye-bye. No problem.
That was great. Yeah. Thank you very much for this.
You're welcome. Take care.
Yeah.
Nice to meet you, Aubrey.
Yeah.
Okay.